Hello everyone, how are you guys doing? I hope that everyone is doing fine. So in this lecture, I will be covering government actions in markets, and so we'll take a look at some of the government actions which sometimes are taken to basically intervene in the markets for a possibly better outcome, and we'll take a look at the consequences of those and the intentions of those and whatnot. So the central question which underlies this chapter is that, can Congress repeal the law of market forces? So think about the case of the minimum wage. So that is a very hot topic, and whenever the election cycle comes around, this becomes an even hotter topic because politicians try to lobby behind these issues in order to gain more votes. So what happens is that, like, if the market, for example, decides that the market equilibrium wage is, let's suppose, $7 an hour. Now, can the Congress intervene, can the government intervene to actually increase the minimum wage from the market equilibrium wage? So the answer is yes, they can, and government has in the past always tried to intervene in certain situations, and we'll take a look at what are the consequences of these sort of interventions. So let's take a quick look at the checklist of this chapter, what the different subtopics we will be covering. So the first subtopic that we'll be covering is the case of the price ceiling, and the classic example that we will be taking a look at is the case of rent ceiling. The second thing that we'll be covering is the case of price floors, and once again the classic example of the price floors, which is most commonly discussed in all the principles levels microeconomics textbooks, is the case of minimum wage, and that is what we'll be taking a look at. And the third thing that we'll be covering is the case for production quotas. And the example that we'll be taking a look at is the case of an agricultural product from abroad. So obviously all of these will have consequences for the efficiency in the market and the fairness in the market, and we will take a look at all these issues. So the first kind of government intervention that we will take a look at is the case of price ceilings. A price ceiling, what is the formal definition? The formal definition is that a price ceiling is a government regulation that places an upper limit on the price at which a particular good, service, or factor of production may be traded. So the most common example that we take a look at when we are discussing the issue of price ceilings is the case of housing rents, of price ceiling on housing rents. What does that really mean? So if you go to certain parts of US, for example, San Francisco or New York City, so the rents in these cities, especially in some areas of the cities, are so exorbitantly high that people find it really, really unaffordable to live in those cities. So the government in these sort of situations might decide that, okay, we will not allow any landlord to actually charge a rent higher than the rent ceiling, higher than the rent which the government deems to be rent ceiling. So basically, if anyone charges a rent above that rent ceiling, they are thought of as taking part in an illegal activity. So trading above the price ceiling essentially becomes illegal. So the formal definition of a rent ceiling is that it is a regulation that makes it illegal to charge more than a specified rent for housing. So just like I said before, in areas of the country where housing is really unaffordable, the government might say that, okay, no one should be allowed to charge above a certain rent, which is considered to be the affordable rent for an average income earning household. So the effect of a rent ceiling depends on whether it is imposed at a level above or below the market equilibrium rent. So why will this have implication for the rent ceiling? It is simply because if the rent ceiling is imposed above the market equilibrium rent, nothing in the market will change, because people are already paying a higher rent and they are actually happy over there, because the quantity demanded of apartments would be equal to the quantity supplied of apartments. But the rent ceiling will only be effective if it is actually imposed below the market equilibrium rent, and we will take a look at why that is the case in the next couple of slides. So the figure on the slide shows the market for apartments. As you can see over here, the equilibrium rent comes out to be $550 a month, and the equilibrium quantity of apartments come out to be 4,000 units of housing. So what that simply means is that at this equilibrium, everyone is at their happy point, because the quantity demanded of apartments is equal to the quantity supplied of apartments. So just like I said before, if a rent ceiling is set above the equilibrium rent of $550, nothing will really change in this market, because everyone is happy at $550 rent per month. The suppliers are happy, the demanders are happy, so nothing is actually going to change. The only change will occur if the rent ceiling is actually imposed below the equilibrium rent. And why will that be the case? Because let's suppose that the government thinks that, or the policymakers think that the rent of $550 a month is too high, because it becomes unaffordable for people to actually afford that. Then they can think of a way to actually reduce the rent, and the only way that they will intervene in this market would be through the use of a rent ceiling, meaning they can say that, for example, that no one should be charging a rent above $400 a month. So let's take a look at that example. So if a rent ceiling of $400 a month is actually imposed because of affordability issues, what changes will happen in this market? So what we have to look at is this line which shows $400 per month rent, and we will take a look at what will be the quantity supplied of apartments at this rent and what will be the quantity demanded of apartments at this rent. So obviously, when there was no rent ceiling, the quantity supplied and quantity demanded were equal to each other, and those were 4,000 units of apartments. Now you can see that the quantity supplied has actually gone down to 3,000 units of housing, or 3,000 units of apartments. While on the other hand, obviously consumers or people who are demanding apartments want to take advantage of this lower rent, so the quantity demanded of apartments has actually gone up from 4,000 units to 6,000 units. So now we have to take a look at what actually does this entail in this market. So obviously you can see that the quantity demanded becomes higher than quantity supplied. Now think about this. What really happens in the market when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied? Is it a case of excess demand or excess supply? It is a case of excess demand, because the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied. Now whenever there is a case of excess demand, does it cause a shortage in the market, or does it cause a surplus in the market? Now think about this for a second. So whenever there is a case of excess demand in a market, it causes a shortage. And the very easy way to think about this is that since the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied, it basically means that there is a shortage of apartments in this market. So let's take a look at what really happens in the next slide. So as I was explaining, the quantity supplied is equal to 3,000 units, the quantity demanded is equal to 6,000 units, so it essentially causes a shortage of 3,000 units, which can be shown over here. So 6,000 minus 3,000 is equal to 3,000 apartments, and that is the shortage that is created when the government actually imposes this rent ceiling. If you look at this region over here above the rent ceiling line, this light blue colored area. So this is called the illegal region, and that is simply because if anyone charges a rent in this region, that would be considered illegal by the government which is imposing the rent ceiling in the first place. So an important question becomes that are people actually happy with this rent ceiling? So think about this for a second. So the quantity demanded has gone up, the quantity supplied has gone down. Now in this kind of a situation, it will be hard to, or at least harder to find an apartment because of the shortage which has been created because of this government intervention. So in this situation of a shortage, when it has become harder to find an apartment, those people who actually do find an apartment will definitely be happier than before because they will be paying a lower rent of $400 rather than a higher rent of $600, which was the equilibrium rent. But on the other hand, there might be a lot of people who were actually willing to pay the equilibrium rent, but now they will not be able to find housing for themselves because of this shortage. So it's hard to say, it's actually impossible to say that everyone in the market will be happy. So some people will be happier, but some people will actually not be happier than before when there was no price intervention. So whenever this sort of a rent ceiling creates a housing shortage, two important things happen. The first one is that a black market emerges. And why does this black market emerges? It's simply because when there are people who are actually willing to pay a rent of higher than the government imposed rent ceiling. How do they get an apartment then? Because of this shortage, so they will have to rely on black market measures. So for example, a supplier of an apartment might say that, okay, so you can only provide me the legal rent of $400 a month, but on top of that you can just pay me under the table in the form of key money or some other form of under the table payment so that I can give you the apartment, because even for the suppliers, the rent of $400 a month is not the ideal outcome, because previously when they were actually charging the equilibrium rent, it was a higher rent. So there's incentive on both sides, the supply side and the demand side, to be actually involved in a black market, because people want to find apartments for which there is a shortage of, and suppliers of apartments want to earn a higher rent. So the other thing which will happen because of this shortage is increased search activity. And what does that really mean? So it simply means that resources such as time, effort, and money will be lost in looking for apartments. Why is that the case? It's simply because there's a shortage of apartments now in this housing market. So previously there was no shortage, the quantity demanded was equal to the quantity supplied, but now after the intervention of the rent ceiling, there's a shortage, which means that people have to engage in increased search activity to get an apartment. So this figure shows how a rent ceiling creates a black market and a housing search. So think about this. So with a rent ceiling of $4,000 a month, which is shown by this red line over here, only 3,000 units of housing are available because the quantity supplied of housing has gone down. Which simply means that if you go up from this point to the demand curve, simply means that there is someone who is actually willing to pay a rent of $625 a month for the 3,000th unit of housing. Now why is that the case? It's simply the case because, once again, think about the demand curve as showing the willingness to pay for a product. In this scenario, the product is the apartments that the people are after. So what this simply means is that when the quantity of housing or apartments in the market is 3,000 units, the willingness to pay for the last unit of apartment is $625, which simply means that there is someone out there in the market who is actually willing to pay a rent higher than the rent ceiling and up to a rent of $625 a month, because that is what the demand curve is actually showing us for a quantity of 3,000 units available in the market. Now, when that is the case, it means that two things can happen. So for what I mentioned before, the existence of a black market and also the existence of increased search activity. So both of these will be affected in the sense that since people would be willing to pay a rent of $625 a month rather than the rent ceiling of $400 a month, it means that this increased rent of $225 might actually be paid in the black market or through the black market as under the table payments to landlords in order to get the apartments for which there is a shortage of now. The other thing which can happen is that increased search activity would mean that people are actually willing to actually use resources in terms of time and money of up to $225 a month in order to find apartments for which there is a shortage of now. So you can clearly see that the incentive to take part in the black market and also the incentive to spend more time and resources for search activity becomes higher because of this shortage, which is caused by the price intervention of rent ceiling. Now, the important question that becomes hard to answer is that are rent ceilings efficient? Well, I mean, the efficient part is kind of easy to answer because obviously we are no longer at the efficient outcome where the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So definitely with the rent ceiling, the outcome is not efficient. It is actually an inefficient outcome. And why is that the case? It's simply because the marginal benefit is higher than the marginal cost. So you can see over here the marginal benefit, which is shown by the demand curve, is higher than the marginal cost, which is shown by the supply curve. So total surplus, the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus, actually shrinks after this price intervention, after the rent ceiling implementation. And we also find the existence of a deadweight loss after this intervention is actually done by the government. So why does this deadweight loss occur? It's simply because people who cannot find housing and landlords who cannot offer housing at a lower rent lose. So think about this for a second. So people are still willing to pay a higher rent up to the market equilibrium rent in order to get housing, but they are no longer able to get housing because of the decreased supply. And if you turn to the supply side, suppliers are willing to charge a higher rent up to the market equilibrium rent, but they cannot do that because the government has now banned them from doing that. So this is simply because of these two reasons that the deadweight loss arises. Now, this figure shows the consumer surplus and the producer surplus in the market for apartments without any government intervention. So as you can see over here, the equilibrium is the point where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, and the consumer surplus is shown by this triangle area over here. Is simply the area above the market equilibrium price but below the demand curve, and it's simply you are basically adding the consumer surplus generated by all the individuals, all the consumers in the market up to the point of the equilibrium rent. Similarly, in the case of producer surplus, this triangle area over here shows us the producer surplus, and what is happening is that we are basically adding the producer surplus generated by all the producers or all the suppliers in this market up to the market equilibrium rent, and at this point zero consumer surplus is generated for the last unit, and zero producer surplus is generated for the last unit of apartment. So as you can see, the consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized over here because consumer surplus plus producer surplus is actually equal to the total surplus. Now, how will this situation change in the case of the imposition of a rent ceiling? Now, how will this change is that since because of rent ceiling only 3,000 units will be supplied, which means only 3,000 units can be rented out by consumers, the consumer surplus shrinks because consumers can no longer extract a surplus up to the 4,000 unit of housing. They can only extract a surplus up to the 3,000th unit of apartments. And that is the same for producer surplus. They can no longer extract the surplus up to the 4,000th unit of apartment. They can only do it up to the 3,000th unit of apartment. So the producer surplus has shrunk from the previous slide. The consumer surplus has also shrunk from the previous slide. Now, an important question becomes what really happens to this area over here, which was previously part of the consumer and producer surplus. We'll take a look at what happens to this area in the next slide. So this triangle area over here, so this small triangle area is called the deadweight loss, and that is simply because consumers cannot find apartments now, even if they are willing to pay the price for it, and producers cannot rent out the apartment up to the rent of equilibrium rent. On the other hand, this triangle area over here shows us the resources lost. So this area of the total surplus has gone now to the resources lost. And why are these resources being lost? These resources are being lost while taking part in increased search activity and while also evading and enforcing the rent ceiling law. What do I mean by evading the rent ceiling law? It simply means that if the renters are taking part in the underground economy, they're basically evading the rent ceiling law. And enforcing the rent ceiling law is also costly because the government has to somehow impose this law, which means that they have to probably hire people, they have to make a new department in order to make sure that this law is actually implemented properly. So resources are lost and a deadweight loss occurs, and both of these are shown by this combined area over here, which was previously part of the total surplus, which was equal to the sum of producer and consumer surplus. So we have already seen that we get to an inefficient outcome with rent ceilings, and that is simply because the total surplus shrinks and resources are lost and a deadweight loss occurs. We are no longer at the equilibrium point where quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So now we have to talk about the fairness aspect. We have already covered the efficiency aspect. Now we'll talk about the fairness aspect. An important question arises that are rent ceilings fair? Well, there are two ways of looking at it, right? So the one way of describing fairness is that are the rules fair? Now the rules are fair in this situation, right? Because the rules are the same for everyone, that no one should be charging a rent higher than $400 a month, and no one should be paying a rent higher than $400 per month. So the rules are the same for everyone, which means that they are probably fair. But are the results fair? Now that becomes a very difficult question to answer, and that is simply because this policy of rent ceiling or price intervention is designed for people who are actually having or facing affordability concerns. Now, is there a way to guarantee that with this sort of a rent ceiling, people who are having the biggest affordability concerns, or who are facing the highest problems as far as affordability is concerned, actually get the apartment? And the simple answer to that would be no, because there is no way of making sure that that happens. First of all, a shortage occurs, which means that not everyone in the market who wants an apartment will get an apartment. And on top of that, because of this shortage, there is no way of making sure that people who are actually facing the most hurdles of affordability are actually getting the apartment at this lower rent. So it definitely means that the results are not fair. So another question which arises is that, does blocking rent adjustments avoid scarcity? So if you look at this problem closely, we've already seen that because of the rent ceiling, a shortage will occur. So actually the problem of scarcity is exacerbated, it's worsened because of this rent ceiling. And people are basically engaging in increased search activity. They are also taking part in illegal activities in order to get an apartment, which simply shows that the scarcity has actually increased. Now, what mechanisms actually allocate resources when prices don't do the job, just like in this case? If prices were allowed to do the job, we would be at the equilibrium where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, but that is not the case now, which means that other sorts of mechanisms will be used, such as participation in black market activities and also increased search activity. Now, are these non-price mechanisms fair? No, they're not, because some people might have an advantage in the black market compared to other people. You might need to know some people in order to get a connection in the black market. You might actually need to have insider information in order to participate in the black market. And similarly, not everyone would be able to devote their time and resources to engage in increased search activities. So, which simply means that these non-price mechanisms are not fair. So, if rent ceilings are so bad, why do we still have them? I mean, it's an important question because obviously we have highlighted all the bad aspects or the negative aspects of rent ceilings, but they still exist in cities like New York City and San Francisco. And the simple reason for that is because the current renters gain from the existence of rent ceilings, and it's simply the case that if you have if you actually get an apartment which is a rent ceiling apartment, which is a rent controlled apartment, it would mean that no one can kick you out of that apartment as long as you're paying that lower than the market rent. And you can also, in some cases, actually pass on that apartment to your siblings or to your children when you pass away. So it's a huge advantage to current renters, and in an effort to please the current renters, politicians actually lobby around these issues, and it becomes very unpopular to say that no, we should let the market decide what the rent is. And that is the reason why politicians have to actually go on with these issues, because obviously they want votes. And renters outnumber landlords by a huge margin as far as the voting is concerned. So there are way more renters than there are landlords. So in order to appease or please the majority of the population, politicians lobby around these issues, and rent ceilings don't go anywhere. And like in some cases, rent ceilings can actually tip an election, because if one candidate was actually supporting rent ceilings and the other candidate was not, maybe people will flock to vote for the one who was actually supporting rent ceilings. So that is the reason why even inefficient government interventions like price ceilings, or especially in the case of rent ceilings, they still exist, even if everyone knows that they are inefficient and unfair. So now we are done with the price ceiling part of the lecture, so we will move on to the price floors part of the lecture. So this is another form of government intervention, and this also affects the equilibrium price in the market. So what is the formal definition? A price floor is a government regulation that places a lower limit on the price at which a particular good, service, or factor of production may be traded. Now the classic example which is most commonly used by textbooks, economics textbooks, is the case of minimum wage. Now why is this a common example? Because this is a very common issue, especially in the political circles. Especially whenever the election cycle comes around. So what the policymakers are thinking in this kind of a situation of a minimum wage is that the equilibrium market wage rate is not an affordable wage rate, or is not a living wage for most people. So that's why they should impose a minimum wage which is actually higher than the market equilibrium wage. So the case so this is an opposite case to the case of price ceiling, and as the name suggests, price floor should work in the opposite way as price ceilings. So essentially over here, trading below the price floor is illegal. On the other hand, in the case of price ceilings, trading above the price ceiling was illegal, but in this case, trading below the price floor becomes illegal. Alright, so this figure shows the market for fast food servers. So according to this market, the equilibrium point where the quantity supplied for fast food servers is equal to the quantity demanded of fast food servers, it is at this point over here, and at this point the market equilibrium wage rate becomes $7 an hour, and the number of people who are actually hired becomes 6,000 workers, which means that the quantity supplied of workers is equal to the quantity demanded of workers at this equilibrium. Now, how will this equilibrium change if a minimum wage law is imposed by the government? So first of all, we have to define what a minimum wage law actually is. So a minimum wage law is a government regulation that makes hiring labor for less than a specified wage illegal. So once again, so if anyone is caught paying people below this minimum wage, they're actually taking part in an illegal activity and they can be punished for it. So firms can pay a wage rate above the minimum wage, but they cannot pay a wage rate below the minimum wage, essentially. And just like in the case of price ceiling or rent ceiling, the effect of a minimum wage depends on whether it is set above or below the market equilibrium wage rate. So if the minimum wage is set below the market equilibrium wage rate, nothing will happen because everyone is already happy getting a higher wage, which is the equilibrium wage rate. But if the minimum wage rate is imposed above the market equilibrium wage rate, only then the minimum wage law will actually affect the market. Now this figure shows how a minimum wage creates unemployment. So if, for example, the government decides that a minimum wage rate of $10 should be imposed in this market, what that simply means is that the quantity demanded and quantity supplied will actually change because this minimum wage has been imposed. So now just think about this for a second. Now moving from an equilibrium wage rate of $7 an hour to $10 an hour, is there more incentive to hire people? No, it is actually less incentive to hire people from the demand side. Now on the supply side, the supply of workers will actually increase because there is more incentive to work now because you're getting a higher wage rate per hour than before. So in this kind of a situation, what will happen is that the quantity demanded for workers is going to decrease while the quantity supplied of workers is going to increase. And obviously whenever the quantity supplied of workers is greater than the quantity demanded of workers, it means there is unemployment in the market, and the total unemployment in the market will be 8,000 minus 3,000, which is equal to 5,000 people who are unemployed. So of the 5,000 people unemployed, 3,000 have been fired and another 2,000 would like to work at $10 an hour. Now going back to this slide, this earlier slide, what does that really mean? So if you look at this point, which is the equilibrium point, at this point 6,000 workers were actually hired, but now only 3,000 workers are hired. So 6,000 minus 3,000 is the number of people who have been fired now because of this unemployment. So 3,000 people have been fired from their existing jobs, while if you look at this other side, now the quantity supplied has gone up from 6,000 to 8,000. So it means that 2,000 individuals who were previously not taking part in the labor force are now actually wanting to work, which means that unemployment is of 5,000 people consists of 3,000 people who have been fired and 2,000 people who would now like to work at a wage rate of $10 an hour. So in essence, the 3,000 jobs that are available now have to be allocated to 8,000 individuals, 8,000 workers. Now that once again causes inefficiency in the market and results in two separate things. So the first one is increased search activity. So just like in the case of rent control or rent ceiling, there was increased search activity in order to get an apartment. So similarly over here, because of this huge unemployment which results because of the minimum wage law, now people have to spend more time and resources in order to find a job. The second thing which will happen is illegal hiring. So illegal hiring will also happen because there is huge unemployment now, and because of this unemployment it simply means that people are actually willing to work at a lower wage than $10 an hour. And similarly on the other side, the demand side, people are willing to hire workers at a wage rate of less than $10 an hour. But when you do that, you're actually taking part in illegal behavior and you're actually doing an illegal hiring. But that black market emerges in the case of price floors as well. Now, how does the minimum wage increase job search? So if you look over here at the minimum wage rate of $10, 3,000 jobs are available, right? So only 3,000 jobs are being available because the demand side dictates that. Which means that if you go down below from this point to the supply curve, which shows the workers, behaviors, it simply means that there is someone willing to take the 3,000 job at a wage rate of $5 an hour, right? So what it simply shows is that because now there are fewer jobs available, people are actually willing to take a job at $5 an hour rather than the minimum wage rate of $10 an hour. But we also have to keep in mind that all of this area below this red line of minimum wage is the illegal region. So if anyone is actually taking part in this region, they are actually taking part in an illegal activity. So increased search activity will happen because people are actually willing to spend time on job search that is worth the equivalent of lowering their wage rate by $5 an hour. In other words, you can think of it as people are actually willing to spend $5 an hour in order to actually look for a job. And on the other side of it, because of the emergence of black market, because of illegal hiring, we can also say that illegal wage rates might range from just below $10 an hour, just below $10 an hour to $5 an hour, because once again there's someone actually willing to supply their labor at a wage rate of $5 an hour for the 3,000 unit of labor. So the incentive is on both sides, the demand side and the supply side. Obviously, if you are demanding labor and you can hire someone for less than the minimum wage rate, it's a beneficial outcome for you. And on the supply side, because of this huge unemployment which has resulted because of the minimum wage law, you would even be willing to work for a wage rate less than $10 an hour. So taking part in this illegal hiring or black market economy is actually beneficial to both sides, but it is a result of an inefficient outcome in the market, because the market price is no longer doing its job of making the quantity supplied equal to the quantity demanded. So the question then becomes, is the minimum wage efficient? So obviously it is not efficient, because the firm's surplus and workers' surplus shrink and a deadweight loss arises. Firms cut back employment and people who cannot find jobs at the higher wage rate lose. So the deadweight loss is arising because firms have to cut back on employment, although they would actually like to hire more people at a lower wage rate, and people who would also like to be hired at a lower wage rate cannot find a job anymore, and because of that the deadweight loss arises. On the other hand, the resources also get lost when people are increasingly spending time on job search activity and also taking part in the black market. So this figure shows the consumer surplus, or you can call it the firm's surplus and the workers' surplus in the case of the labor market. So the firm's surplus is shown by this area of surplus over here, which is above the market equilibrium wage and below the demand curve, the demand for labor curve, while the worker surplus is shown by this region of surplus over here, which is above the supply curve and below the market equilibrium wage rate. So as you can see, without any sort of government intervention, without the imposition of a minimum wage law, the producer surplus and consumer surplus are maximized. Now, how will the total surplus change when a minimum wage law is imposed? Let's take a look at that. Now, only 3,000 workers will be hired after the imposition of the minimum wage law, which means that the firm's surplus will be reduced because they can no longer extract a surplus up to the 6,000 unit of worker. Similarly, the worker surplus will also decrease because they can no longer extract a surplus of up to 6,000 unit of labor. So the question then becomes that firm surplus is decreasing and worker surplus is decreasing, but what is actually happening to this part of the surplus, which was previously part of the firm's and the workers' surplus? So we'll take a look at that in the next slide. So this triangle area becomes the deadweight loss, and it's simply because people over here, the firms over here, are willing to hire workers at a lower wage rate, and workers over here are also willing to get hired at a lower wage rate, but now they cannot do that, and that is simply the reason for this deadweight loss. On the other hand, this rectangle area shows the resources lost, which are lost when people spend more time searching for jobs, and they also take part in the black market activities such as illegal hiring, etc. So once again, we will ask the question as we asked in the case of rent ceiling, that is the minimum wage law fair? Now, is the rule fair? I mean, the rule is fair in this case as well, because the rule is the same for both the workers and the people who are hiring the workers, that no one should be paying less than the minimum wage rate of $10 an hour, and no one should be getting a wage rate which is below the minimum wage rate of $10 an hour. So the rule is the same for both workers and people who are hiring the workers. But is the result fair? Now, the result is not fair at all, because there is no way to ensure that people who actually deserve a minimum wage are actually getting a minimum wage. Because first of all, because of the minimum wage law, there's huge unemployment as a result of that law. And because of that unemployment, people are actually willing to supply their labor at a wage rate below the minimum wage rate and also below the market equilibrium wage rate. So as we saw in the previous slide, people were actually willing to supply their labor at a wage rate of $5 an hour, which is less than the minimum wage rate of $10 an hour, and actually even less than the minimum than the wage rate of the equilibrium market wage rate, which is $7 an hour. So some of the workers are actually way worse off than before, because previously when they were getting the market equilibrium wage rate, they were actually better off than in the situation of unemployment, where they are actually supplying their labor at even a lower wage rate than the market equilibrium wage rate. So if the wage rate doesn't allocate labor, what does in this kind of a situation? So obviously the price is not allowed to do its job in this situation, so the market cannot get to equilibrium. So other mechanisms arise, such as illegal hiring, black market, and increased job search activity. And once again, the question is that are these non-wage allocation mechanisms fair? So the simple answer is no, they are not fair, because once again, you might need to have some sort of a connection to be hired illegally, and also you might, not everyone would have the time and resources to spend looking for a job, which is hard to find after this imposition of the minimum wage law. So if the minimum wage law is so bad, why do we actually have it? So the simple answer is that the effects of minimum wage on employment might be small. So that is one of the reasons, because a lot of the people might actually already be getting a minimum wage, a wage rate which is higher than the minimum wage rate. So the effect on the market might actually be really small. But still, the labor unions might lobby for a minimum wage. And why is that the case? It's simply, once again, because of the political reasons, because labor unions want to exist. And the reason, the number one reason why labor unions exist is because they basically make agreements with the people who are hiring labor that no one should be paid below a certain minimum wage rate. And obviously when people participate in labor unions, they also have to pay labor union dues, which are usually yearly dues. So in order to make sure that labor unions exist and they keep on getting the dues from the labor, they still keep on lobbying for a minimum wage, because obviously that is very crucial to their existence. Now the third kind of government intervention that we will take a look at is the case of production quotas. So governments often intervene in agriculture markets with the aims of blocking the quantity supplied from moving toward the equilibrium quantity. So the biggest reason for these sort of production quotas is that the government wants to regulate the quantity of imports, of agricultural imports, in order to protect the local farmers. In order to protect the local farmers in the local economy, they will actually put restrictions on the imports of certain agricultural products. For example, if corn was allowed to move freely from Mexico to USA, most of the corn in the market for corn will be from Mexico, because it will be it will come to US at a cheaper price than locally grown corn. So in that kind of a scenario, in order to protect local farmers, government use quotas so that they can actually restrict the quantities that can be imported from other countries. So a production quota is simply a government regulation in a market that places an upper limit on the quantity that may be supplied. So the way production quotas differ from rent ceilings or minimum wage laws is that both the price floor and the price ceiling were cases of price restrictions because the restriction was on the prices. But in this scenario, the restriction is on the quantity. So that's why this is called a production quota, and this is a quantity restriction rather than a price restriction. So to make a production quota effective, quotas must be allocated to each producer that sum to the market quota. So individual producers will be given a quota that you cannot produce more than this quota, and which will all add up to the total supply, and that will also amount to the quota restricted supply, which will not be the supply equal to the market equilibrium supply. So an example would be the market for dairy products in California, which is regulated by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And in this market, there's a production quota which exists, meaning that the quantity supplied, the total quantity supplied of dairy products in this market is actually restricted. What this simply means is that the total quantity supplied from other countries such as Mexico in the market for dairy products will be restricted in the form of quotas or through quotas. So this is an example of a market of dairy products in which there is no existence of quota. So you can see that the market is at the equilibrium point, and at the equilibrium the quantity supplied of dairy products is equal to the quantity demanded of dairy products, which simply means that the consumer surplus and the producer surplus are both maximized, which means that there is no wastage of total surplus. And this will change as soon as the quota is imposed. So now a quota of 40 billion pounds per year is imposed, which means that the supply cannot be equal to the market equilibrium supply of 60 billion pounds per year, but the government has actually restricted the supply of dairy products from other countries to 40 billion pounds per year. So what will happen because of this quantity restriction shown by this vertical red line? So what will happen is that the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are going to decrease. So the quantity supplied will obviously be determined by the quota which is set in place, which is equal to 40 billion pounds per year. And because of this shortage of supply, the price will actually go up. And that is the important part which is happening on the demand side, essentially, because previously when the quantity supplied was equal to the quantity demanded, the market price was 10 per pound. But now, because of this reduction in supply caused by the production quota, the market price will actually go up to 20 per pound. So what is happening to the consumer surplus? You can easily see that consumer surplus has shrunk in this scenario. Previously, the consumer surplus was being extracted up to this point, but now it is only extracted up to this quantity restricted point of 40 billion pounds per year. What has happened to the producer surplus? So in this scenario, in this particular example, the producer surplus actually grows, and this is the trapezoid, the trapezoid region of area of the total surplus is now the area which shows the producer surplus, and that actually increases in the case of this example, but an area of deadweight loss also occurs, and that is because people might actually be willing to pay suppliers might be actually willing to supply this quantity over here of 60 billion pounds per year, even at a lower price, and people actually also want to buy dairy products at a lower price, but now they are not able to do that, and that is simply the reason for this existence of the deadweight loss. So let's think about this intuitively as well. So, well, consumers, when there was no production quota, when there was no quantity restriction, consumers were actually paying $10 per pound for dairy products, but now they are paying $20 per pound, which simply means that there has to be a loss in the consumer surplus. On the other hand, producer surplus grows because although they are not able to supply their preferred amount of quantity, but the price has gone up. So the price has gone up from 10 to 20 per pound, which means that they would actually be able to extract a higher producer surplus. So the question in this scenario, which has to be asked as well, is that are production quota efficient or inefficient? So obviously we have shown in the previous slide that whenever a production quota is imposed, it results in a deadweight loss, and whenever there is a deadweight loss, it basically shows that some of the total surplus is lost to the deadweight loss, which means that the market is no longer in an efficient state, simply meaning that production quota is inefficient. Now the other side of the question is that we have already dealt with the efficiency part of it. Now the other side is that are production quotas unfair? So a production quota is actually unfair on both views of fairness. What are the two views? The result view and the rule view. So the result view says that with the quota, well-off farmers benefit and consumers lose. So definitely it is not fair because farmers are gaining more than the consumers in this scenario, and you can see that when you are comparing what happens to producer surplus and consumer surplus as well. Now, according to the rule view, production quota is also unfair, and simply because the quota blocks voluntary exchange. Farmers want to produce more and consumers want to buy more, but they are not permitted by the quota. So once again, it is also unfair as far as the rule view is concerned. So the central question which was underlying this chapter or this lecture was that, can Congress repeal the law of market forces? Can the government introduce rules and regulation which basically bypass the market forces and set in motion changes in the market which cause inefficiency? So obviously they can, and that is why all of these different policies exist, such as rent control, minimum wage laws, and production quotas. But even if the intention is a good one when policymakers are setting out to impose these policies, the outcome might not be the best possible outcome. Because as you have seen in the case of rent ceiling, not everyone is now able to actually get an apartment or find an apartment. Also in the case of minimum wage law, now there are some workers who cannot find jobs. So the outcome might not be the ideal outcome, even if the intention was good, that and the intention was most likely that because of affordability concerns we have to introduce these measures. But as policymakers, you also have to look at what will be the changes in the outcome. Will this policy have some sort of negative consequences? And we have already determined that all of these government interventions will actually have tons of negative aspects attached to them. Now similarly, placing a cap on executive pay, just like introducing a minimum wage law, will also be causing inefficiency in the market, because the quantity of executive services supplied would decrease, because more of these talented executives will actually look for jobs in markets which are unregulated. So the firms, I mean, while they are actually facing the challenge of surviving and creating and making profits, they will also have to deal with the challenge of recruiting and keeping competent executives and directors. So once again, even so, the regulation as far as wages is concerned can work negatively at both ends of the wage distribution. At the lower end, when the government is imposing a minimum wage law, it would mean that some workers might actually be unemployed. And at the higher end, if they actually introduce a maximum wage law, it would also mean that the firms would actually be spending more time looking for workers who would actually stay with the job in the regulated markets, and obviously that will also result in a deadweight loss. So the answer to the question that can Congress repeal the law of market forces? Yes, it can, but it will always be accompanied with negative consequences as far as the inefficiency and unfairness in markets is concerned. So this was the lecture which dealt with government intervention in markets. I hope all of you enjoyed this, and keep watching the lectures, and hope you guys learned about government interventions in markets while watching this lecture. Thank you for watching. Bye.